to really settle with it. But I'm Jay Breslaw. I'm the CEO of Survivors Network, and we support survivors of all ages and genders across Sussex. So we're at the front line when it comes to the everyday challenges that survivors face. And I'm delighted to be joined today by the filmmakers, Jared Watmuff and Maria Hildebrand, and our very own ISVA coordinator. That's at ISVA, Independent Sexual Violence Advisor. So our ISVA coordinator, Helen, and to discuss the Rape Clause film. So welcome and thank you so much for joining. If I can go to you first, Jared. So what drew you to making a topic?
So basically I was writing this short film that was kind of about a slightly separate subject. It was set in this like sort of slight bureaucratic dystopia, and the idea was this couple were trying to apply to have children. So the idea was it was in a world where you had to apply to have children and be parents. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to build the backstory for this world. And as I was doing more research, I came upon this article about this thing called the Rape Clause, which I'd never heard about. And that was kind of this starting point that connected me to all these other things, like the 2-child limit, which is obviously the wider legislation that it falls under. And I think I just found it kind of remarkable and terrifying how there was this policy that was basically putting people in this awful position, and how it existed, and also how I didn't know about it. And then when I spoke to other people about it, it was clear as well that unless you were sort of involved in, unless you were kind of in working in fields that was connected to this, then you might not be aware of it at all. So I to be honest, I just really wanted to say something about it and raise awareness about it, and kind of make people understand, because maybe at first when you describe to somebody, they don't necessarily understand what the big deal is, I dare say. And I kind of wanted to show like what this could mean for somebody, like what this process could be. And it's such a tiny part of lots of long drawn out things, but in itself it can be so traumatic. So yeah, it just made me think, right, this is something that we need to talk about. So yeah.
Oh, definitely. And what an irony that you were actually discussing or thinking about a film in a dystopian future. I think when we see those parallels to how we live today, when we're imagining the most horrific world that we could imagine, I think it really brings it home. Sorry to be really depressing about that, but
no, it's true. That was it. It was like, I kind of felt like I'd started to write this thing that had a kind of, this dystopian, like, it was a bit like Terry Gilliam's film Brazil or something like that. And then I was sort of writing a bit of it. And then I was just like, but this kind of exists in a way, but it's even worse than that, because it's kind of more insidious. It's not as obvious as something like you can only have children if you apply for this thing. It's like putting people in this position, which is forcing them to basically to reveal very personal information in order to sustain the children, which is just maddening, really. So yeah, it's crazy how, and sad how it is. So it's happening now, and at the same time it's sort of like flying under the radar in lots of ways. So
definitely I remember when I first heard about it, and we definitely had a conversation within the women's sector to say, should we be speaking out and saying, actually, we don't want any part of this? Would that make the government change their policy? And I know that some organisations decided to not be supportive at all, but the reality is that I don't think that had any difference. That the government had decided they wanted to proceed with this, or that they felt like this was the best way to proceed with the 2-child policy. But I hear you as well. When it first came in, I thought, surely not. There's got to be outrage. With so many things that have come in, maybe the drip, slowly, like you say, it just flies under the radar, and before we know it, this policy has been in place for several years.
Yeah, it's amazing how much they've defended it as well, and how, so like, for instance, obviously in the film you see Aston McVeigh talking about it, and she's trying to sort of spin it as this positive thing that allows people to potentially talk about something, like, which is crazy in itself. And then they have, I think when they started to put this policy in place, before it was in place, they had a consultation with various organizations, and it was like a unanimous kind of rejection across the board, from like church groups to charities to the Royal Nursing Union. I don't know the name of it. they were just like, this is a bad idea because for various reasons. So, and then obviously they just did it anyway. So it's still here. Like, it's still part of the 2-child limit, and it's just kind of amazing how people don't seem to really, well, at least they don't seem to really mind that much about it. So yeah.
Yes, well, in some ways it's not surprising, but you know, I was so pleased that you did pick up on this, and also not just think this is shocking, I can, you know, chat to the people I know about it, but actually say, what can I do to raise awareness of this amongst the wider film lovers. Maria, I know that you've been on board with this project and the idea right from the beginning, so tell me about how you got involved, and then also what you did to research your role.
Jared and I have known each other for quite a few years. So we've always been kind of collaborating on each other's projects. And when he came with the rape clause, I thought, how do you make that human? What are I mean, it's government legislation, it's a form. So then how do you go back and look at it? Okay, if it was a person, how would it affect them? And what is the specific story? So I had to do, as you say, a lot of research. I kind of went into a rabbit hole of looking at interviews from women, all types of ages. It was mainly women that I researched. And it was just hearing their stories, and I got so immersed in picturing the lives of different types of relationships, how it can come to a level of domestic abuse for, you know, this legislation at some point to impact you. So I had to kind of go backwards in order to come to the rape clause, as it were. Yeah, so it was the research that I really took time to involve myself in, and it really kind of took an effect on me without even knowing it. I worked part-time at a fitness studio at the time, and it's kind of expected that you're light, happy, but you can't really take yourself out of that once you've heard hours and you've seen the people speaking about their real 3D experience with their husbands or their boyfriends, how it affected their children, all this kind of thing, what kind of different abuse versions there are. There's emotional, physical, all of this. I had to kind of take that into account and then build the story from there. So I think that was the main way I looked at it. Yeah. Wow.
It's great to get an insight into all the sort of preparation and research that's gone into preparing for this sort of role, and it was such a powerful portrayal. I'd just like to remind the people watching that obviously these are the questions that, you know, myself and the panelists thought about, but if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please pop them in the chat, and we'll get to questions hopefully later on in the session. So Jared, if I can go back to you, I'm thinking about your process, the sort of writing and then moving into directing the film. What challenges did you face? We've heard about some of the challenges that Maria faced. Were they similar to you, or were there, you know, how's your process affected?
I suppose one of the first challenges, the immediate challenge right off the bat, was the realization that this is a story about women. It's a women's story, and as a man, I was coming into that thinking, well, there's aspects of this that I won't understand, and my presumption and my perspective will potentially like obscure some of those truths. And just being aware that, I suppose there was a huge challenge, and I think in all honesty I'm still kind of wrangling with that. It's always going to be part of the process of trying to be open and listen, and that's always been a huge challenge. And I think to try to deal with that constantly throughout this process, I was trying to basically get as many women as possible on board from the get-go to advise. And then in production, we had Laura, who was our DP, who was helping also advise from behind the camera, but how the film might feel, how the characterization might work, and just trying to feed in and pull that in as much as possible. So I had as much experience on hand to use. And Maria was talking there about, yeah, all this preparation we did. The script very much, I feel, was this collaborative process to develop Angela's character. We had we had lots of like rehearsals together where we were just talking about Angela's backstory and like filling in all these little details. And for me, that was really helpful to sort of like sink more into that character as well and feel like I was understanding it a little bit more. So I'd say, yeah, that has been and is a huge challenge, and I also think that's a good challenge, and I'm kind of glad that I'm aware of that. And then I suppose second, the other big thing was this idea of all the information. There's just so much information that came with this, and from the idea this is government legislation, and how do you explain this kind of potentially quite obscure piece of government legislation to everyone in terms of like something they can understand as part of a plot. But then also how do you sort of like lean into the facts about how it kind of like how people I'm getting confused. Basically how people are affected by this on a day-to-day basis. So how many, for instance, how you don't get any rape like prosecutions. So for instance, I think in 2019, 2020, there were 55,000 rape cases brought to CPS, and only 2,000 of them were charged, which is about 3%, and even less had convictions. And things like that, all these little details that I feel like I was trying to pull in there a little bit, and trying to lean into. And also in terms of how the process itself, how the interview would go, I had no experience of that background. And that's when I contacted you guys and contacted Helen, because I really wanted to make sure that it was clear that if there was any villain in this story, an immediate villain in terms of the story itself, it would be the form, and it wouldn't be the advocate character, because that it's the kind of idea is that they're obviously working with this really obtuse, really like terrible piece of this terrible tool, and they're trying to make it as seamless and as easy as possible, but invariably there'll be awkwardness there that's arising from that. Yeah. So there was all this information like to try to process and try to get into a narrative, and that was very difficult. And I think it didn't just stop with the script and the writing, and even in the production, it felt like way into the edit, I was using some of those resources that Maria was talking about, some of those testimonies, and just listening to those testimonies again helped to help me edit and help me kind of figure out how to sort of like switch around lines to make it make sense in terms of the experience. So it's been a huge learning curve, I think, and I keep feeling like I'm learning more, and I'm also forgetting more each time. So
because I think also the challenge and the danger is that we might unauthentically represent the story. So as Jared said, he got a lot of input from all the females on set. Like I remember he had a conversation with our makeup artist, our DP Laura was very involved. So I think at every stage, just the challenge was the fear of getting it wrong, as it were, or misrepresenting, I think.
Definitely.
I think one of the things, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to bring Helen in to say that I think, Jared, you reached out to Helen for some sort of help with some of the language. Is that what happened?
Yes. Do you want to answer, Helen? Or
yeah, it feels like a whole lifetime ago that we spoke, but it was thinking about the language, how we might support clients in appointments, and how we might talk to someone who's experienced such kind of deep interpersonal trauma. And it's hard because we haven't seen huge amounts of people come our way for support around this paperwork. So it was hard to comment specifically from that angle. And I think that in itself speaks volumes how few people we've had come our way as a supportive rape crisis centre, as someone as a place who should be trauma sensitive and understanding, and not making it any more onerous than it needs to be, making it as touch as possible. And we've still seen very few people come our way, which I think tells us quite a story about, that people aren't necessarily engaging it with this process because of it being so obstructive. And so I'd say to a point dehumanizing and harmful to survivors. So I think I spoke from my experiences working within the criminal justice process, which there are parallels around feeling as though they might be quite cold systems and quite impassive systems that weren't designed originally with trauma and survivors in mind. And they would, and how we then have this very painful, very sensitive human experience and this quite mechanical process, and finding, you know, as a rape crisis centre being a kind of a meeting place in between to try and support, you know, this with this. And so I could speak to it from that angle.
I think one of the things that maybe this sounds obvious as well to anyone listening, but one of the things that I was so kind of like when you described it was so clear, but yeah, I hadn't even thought about, was when you, in these conversations generally, that you described this empowerment model and how you allow those conversations to be led by those people, because obviously if it allows them to, it doesn't put them in a dynamic which they might have previously experienced. And that is, it's so obvious in a way, but at the same time, I just hadn't even thought about it, which I don't know, it goes to show how this stuff, yeah.
Helen, do you want to say a bit more about the empowerment model, just in case people don't, you know, it's a term they're not familiar with?
Yeah, so it's really kind of having the survivor at the heart of what happens next. It's kind of putting, you know, giving information and options, not imposing anything on someone, because again, thinking if we're doing anything where we are taking control and imposing our own agenda, how that might replicate dynamics of abuse or assault. And so it's really, really just so core and vital to the work that we steer clear of anything that replicates those dynamics. And so we find that a lot of it is giving information, and not in a way that doesn't overwhelm people, because if we think that trauma, it does affect those parts of the brain that can process and store memory and process and store information. So being really, really careful with the pace of things, again, thinking about replicating abusive dynamics or assault, ensuring that person is able to take control of the pace of the support, of the information they're getting, checking in that, you know, things are at a pace that's okay with that person, or if they need a break, if they want to step away from the process completely, be it therapeutic services or the support with the criminal justice system, or even just finding out information. People do need to kind of maybe dip in their toes sometimes, dip back out. Some people are okay to kind of just get involved and start unpacking stuff. Some people do need to be a bit more tentative, and it's completely just respecting wherever someone's at and what they might need. You see it with, even from the kind of flip side, a lot of people might feel quite keen that survivors report their experience to the police, for example, and we do a lot of work around that, around, you know, actually it is, I think, this statistic might change, but it was only 15% of survivors report to the police. So it's clearly not for everyone. And even if it did become a perfect system, it's never going to be 100% of people that's right for. But we get a lot of, on the flip side, where people might be really pushing a survivor to receive therapeutic support or kind of more emotional support, which you know seems almost quite a lovely thing. Of course, you want someone to have this kind of this place where they can go and process what's gone on and recover, but actually it's completely down to that survivor what their recovery journey looks like. And if they can't deal with it, if that's not where they're at, and it might be never be where they're at, then it's being respectful of that and not colluding with any kind of oppressive type behaviors that force someone, you know, to do something that might not be right for them or at the wrong time for them.
Thanks, Helen. I think that's a great point. Jared, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to, something that I also just realized as well when you were saying that, this is sort of, so it's such a, even the language itself is something that coming into this that I sort of almost wasn't aware of, and how I kind of had to change the perspective a little bit, and how we've been using the word survivor and how important that is. And I think, like previously, I would have just thought victim or something, and that switch in language from and change of agency can actually is so important to talking about culpability as well, and just the little things like that can have such a significant difference. It was speaking to you, Helen, and speaking to other people that just kind of helped me open my eyes to that, and I think was very important. So,
oh well, thank you for this. Great, you know, it's really great, Jared, that you're open to thinking about other lenses through which you can see things, because sometimes as we go about our everyday life, we kind of get stuck in the same lens. But if I can come to you, Maria, I imagine it was a really emotional role to play, and obviously you've mentioned earlier about your job that was quite different, but also hearing of some of the sort of knowledge and expertise that Helen's been sharing. How did you prepare for that actual emotional journey of Angela, and how did you find sort of playing that role affected you?
Yeah, I kind of cut off because I got lost in my answer before. But since I was working at that other job, I just started not being able to cut off from the knowledge of survivors. And people would make a remark around the weeks just before filming where I was getting very into the script and very into the research. And they would say, like, what's wrong? Like, usually you're such a bright and, you know, upbeat person. But I don't know, it just affected my entire mood because I felt like I was living with these stories. So I knew that on the day of filming, that was necessary to bring all of that into the room, to the way that once the camera was rolling, everybody needed to feel that heaviness and that kind of that weight on her shoulders. And if the crew, so I'm talking specifically about the sound team, everybody on the camera team, they needed to feel a bit changed after we got to the end of the day, because if they didn't, then I didn't do my job and I didn't live kind of the courage and bravery that so many survivors do live with. Because I think going back to Jared's point of the idea of, you know, victim, rape victim, all of these terms, even terms like victim of domestic abuse, something that jumped out at me through all these interviews was women, because I mainly researched women. Maybe we can talk about male survivors later. I know there's a question in the question box, but these women, it takes a lot to endure years of abuse. It takes a lot because you're kind of always having to swallow it, make it okay, harmonize it. So I tried to, by the end of the filming day, basically, my emotions needed to feel uncomfortable, but it had to bleed into the room. So I think by the point I reached the panic attack, the air was heavy. And then I used kind of, this is very like just physical technique. Like you can play around with your breathing so it just doesn't work like it breathe in, breathe out. It kind of starts to make you feel claustrophobic, you stress, your physical system starts to, you know, cave up. And that's kind of how all of those things, a 3D approach got me there and got the crew there, because I think after it was a bit like, yeah, we had to step back and say, okay, let's take a break. So, yeah.
And is that
very heavy. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is that your experience, Jared? How was your experience of the filming, or particularly on that day?
I think.
I mean, it was Maria's totally right. There was this atmosphere that was just sort of there. It was this thick. It was, and I also just want to credit Laura here as well with in building up to that panic attack. I think Laura actually initially, when I was with the direction, I was quite tentative to. I almost wanted it to be more subtle. I think initially, especially on the day that is. So I almost didn't want to sort of show as much of a panic attack, but I think talking to Laura and Maria as well, it was kind of almost like this could be a moment of catharsis. And I think Laura also like kind of pointed that out. And I think that kind of allowed those emotions to have kind of a bit of an arc or a natural kind of flow to them as well. I don't know if you feel exactly the same, Maria, but I think that Laura helped to pull some of that out and then make that experience feel like, well, just help us pull all of us into that experience a little bit. So. Yeah.
Laura was quite brave. She basically pushed the camera into my face at the right moment when I really erupted. So she kind of had a very good sixth sense of like, okay, it's going to happen. So
yeah, she had this. Well, she was very. She came up with the idea for the diopter shots. So a lot of obviously the film is like this cut off. Well, sort of like restricted, very locked off camera, and it has that pull in. And then after the panic attack, we cut to that very close up handheld stuff, and that was her idea. And I think it just helps for me. It pulls me right into Angela's character, and I just think it's so necessary in a way to feel like we're connecting with her in that moment. And credit to her for that. Yeah,
brilliant. When I was listening to it, I don't know what you were thinking, Helen, but it was actually making me think about some of the work that we do in supporting survivors who are experiencing, an emotional response. It kind of like the inverse. So I know, I don't know if you want to speak to that a little, Helen, just around some of the strategies that you can use to bring people into a more normal space.
Yeah, when Maria was talking about inducing that kind of panic attack type breathing, that kind of popped into my head as well, because we do use breathing techniques as a means of grounding, because if someone is getting triggered in terms of their trauma, that's part of the autonomic nervous system we can bring under conscious control. So actually we can use it as the inverse, like Jay said, try and regulate that breathing when it is kind of, if our body's responding as though a threat's happening in the here and now, which is what trauma is doing a lot of the time. It's telling us the threat is happening because our brain hasn't put a full stop on the end of that experience, because it hasn't processed that memory in the same way that it normally does. So what we can do is use breathing techniques to help bring in that regulation, help calm our systems down, or sometimes even potentially liven them up a bit if someone's a bit more dissociative and kind of tipping out the other way when they're not kind of psychologically in the room, and their breathing might have slowed down quite a bit. So we can really notice what's going on with our clients. It's really common seeing that very shallow kind of high chest breathing, fast in and out, because the body's primed for action. And so thinking about how we can calm that right down and calm that system down. We have a whole on our website we've got a variety of resources. So if anyone is interested, we've got a self-help book, and that will talk about various grounding techniques, because there are lots of different ways in which trauma can manifest and trauma symptoms can manifest, and each survivor will be individual in what will help them in terms of their triggers, in terms of managing their triggers and managing those trauma responses, being able to kind of then again regulate their system to a calmer level.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for that, Helen. I was just wondering, just back to you again, Helen. We know that the rape clause is one of many barriers for survivors, like to barriers to them accessing the support or resources. And obviously, Jared has referenced some stats around the criminal justice system. What are other barriers or current issues facing survivors that you think people ought to know about?
Certainly the criminal justice system. I was looking at those figures just this afternoon, those same figures, because I'm going to be talking to people on Friday about sexual violence and the criminal justice system. It was the lowest conviction rate since records began in terms of sexual violence, and so there's a lot that's been going on to kind of feed into that decline, and it is a huge issue. It's a real public concern, and I feel we should be outraged and really up in arms about this. That is something that's so striking and so just not okay. We're not delivering justice for survivors. And when we think about the flip side, which the people that normally get taken out of the conversation, the perpetrators, we're not holding perpetrators to account. We're not responding to them effectively. We're not kind of managing the risks that they pose to us as individuals in our communities. So I think that's such a big topic. And again, I'm very biased because that's the area of work that I operate in, is survivors of sexual violence and abuse within the criminal justice system. So for me, that is really present. But again, I'm aware that the majority of survivors may never report to the police. I think an ongoing barrier, an ongoing concern for survivors, one thing that I think has been there just throughout forever, and we still really grapple with, is public perception, myths and stigma. That's a huge thing that we have made a lot of movement on, and I think particularly since Me Too happened and Operation U-Tree, we've been able to challenge some of the preconceptions that people have had, challenge some of the myths, which only serve to effectively support perpetrators, because again, we're not seeing them as who they are, we're seeing them as some stranger in an alleyway, whereas that as this film demonstrated, that was someone in the household. But so kind of better representing different survivors' experiences and understanding why people respond how they respond. Not all survivors, very few survivors will scream, kick out, fight back because of what goes on in terms of the fear responses. So just a better understanding about what goes on for survivors and why, who perpetrators might be and why, and not seeing survivors as a homogenous group. So public perception is a biggie for me. I mean, I don't know how long you've got, but I want to speak to just, there was a couple other points I want to speak to, but one is around services and adequate funding for services, because we're not a statutory service. I don't know anywhere where our type of support is a statutory service, where if you think the social costs of the impact of sexual violence, how prevalent, wide-ranging and wide-reaching they are, yet these still aren't funded as statutory services, what we're doing. And that to me seems quite odd, quite strange. And what that means is that services get recommissioned, services lose their funding, it's chopping and changing. So someone might have known that this service supported sexual violence survivors, and then all of a sudden that's gone, and they have to figure out who the next provider is, and how impactful that is for survivors to not have that consistency of care, and for services to be able to deliver quality services ongoing if they've got an eye to commissioning all the time. You know, that's a bit of psychological energy and a lot of time and resource that could be spent delivering the quality service to survivors, actually. So thinking about that, and the impact on waiting times as well, being adequately funded would mean that we'd be able to offer services within a timely manner, but waiting times go up and up and up because we just don't have enough resource for the demand that's coming in, for the amount of ask that we have for our therapeutic services, or for our ISFA services, for instance. So there's that, and just generally, I think I feel that society isn't set up in a trauma-informed way. We're not set up. Most of our kind of systems, as we've spoken here, the benefit system isn't necessarily set up in the most trauma-informed way. The criminal justice system isn't necessarily set up in the most trauma-informed way. But if we think of, I'm just thinking about other kind of examples where how many female identified survivors or people with missed cervical screenings because of those not being set up in trauma-informed ways, or just they might well be, but that's not necessarily advertised, and things around pregnancy care and how that can be very triggering for a lot of people, and there might be a level of avoidance around certain appointments, very critical appointments, because of the fear of being triggered or what that might bring up for someone. Similarly, with things like dentist appointments, we know a lot of survivors miss things like dental care because it's an intrusive, invasive procedure, and it can be very triggering. It's so wide-reaching that I just put the headline as society isn't necessarily set up in a trauma-informed way, which just repeatedly disadvantages survivors.
Yes, I agree. And I think if we look at the figures, I think the kind of common figure is that 1 in 3 women have experienced rape and sexual assault, and 1 in 6 men. So if we think about the volumes of people who've had these experiences, and then the levels of funding compared to the need, and there's also some research out today that almost all young women have experienced sexual harassment. It's absolutely shocking and terrifying, and sometimes it's easier to just not look and not think about those statistics. So, I'd like to really thank you, Jared and Maria. Obviously, Helen and I, this is our day-to-day life, and we're sort of thinking about it and supporting people and thinking about how we can bring in more income and use that money as effectively as possible. But Jared, when you're thinking about this film, who is it for?
Well, I was going to say, I think that's kind of the challenge in a way, right? It's trying to say, like, kind of make people aware of this stuff, like, and say, why aren't people paying more attention to this? Which is, it's so those figures are just so shocking. And the one you just talked about as well, the one that came out today, and yet why aren't people engaging with it? So I think part of the challenge of work like this is to try and, make those issues palatable to people. And maybe there's a benefit to films and cinema there, that they can sort of potentially put these issues into places where people don't usually think about them, and then get these people to engage with topics they wouldn't usually engage with. I think that's, like, for filmmakers and audiences, that is a responsibility that we have to take quite seriously. I mean, I kind of think that it's almost like you need to take it as seriously as something like going to the polls or something. Like, if you stop engaging with, like, stories of real people around you, then you kind of, like, negating the world. I don't think you have to agree about how those stories are, how they're done, or if they're done well. But I think it's important to engage with that. So I'd say that a film, like I intend this film to be for everyone who it's suitable for, like obviously of a certain age. But I think it's important that we all open our minds a little bit to these kinds of stories, and try to have a bit more compassion in that respect. I'd say that's kind of my answer. I understand why lots of people watch. Obviously, lots of people watch film and stuff as an escape. Like they don't want to necessarily engage with real life, and I think that also. But then there's a challenge there in finding ways to talk about real life through these mediums. So yeah.
Thank you. I think probably now would be a good time to go to one of the questions that have come in from our audience that links quite well with some of the things that Helen's just been speaking about. So this can go to Helen or to any of the panelists. So do you feel that like trauma-informed training should be mandatory for workers in the DWP? And if so, how could you make that happen? And I guess linking to another one of the questions, should rape crisis centres be taking responsibility for this sort of work? Helen, are you happy to come in there?
Yeah. I would love it to be mandatory. I think, and not just, I think any kind of institution where there are expectations upon a person to respond in a certain way, and it feels vital. So one thing that I didn't mention is educational establishments. How people do struggle in certain environments if they've got experiences of trauma, and those environments feeling rigid and cold and inflexible. So certainly I think the DWP would really benefit from trauma-informed care to be better responding to people's lives and the people that are seeing. Because even aside from the rape clause, we've had lots of survivors who might have been assaulted in a workplace setting, and so all of a sudden they're leaving their work unplanned and signing on. And how do they get into that? How do they get into that conversation? How do they explain? How do they navigate those systems? And so to have workers ready and able to have those conversations and support them well feels really, really vital, because people aren't necessarily turning up because everything's going super well to those appointments, potentially. So yes, I think, and I don't know, for rape crisis centres, we can be in the position of campaigning, and if they want training, delivered, then I feel like we're very well placed to be talking from experience and from our learning and from our specialism. But we'd be campaigning to central government, I imagine. That would be where the direction would be coming from. So yes, we can do the campaigning, but whether it gets picked up or not is another matter.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. But in recent years, Helen and I obviously work really closely together, and we have seen different agencies reaching out for trauma-informed training, like the police, like probation services. I know that Helen delivers loads of fantastic training for Survivors Network. So certainly over the last 5 years, I have seen an increase, but perhaps not from central government, certainly not that I'm aware of, not that I'm aware of everything. Jared and Maria, did you have anything that you wanted to add? I see Jared, you want to say?
I was just curious if to me that sounds like a good idea, not just for sort of the DWP and those kinds of agencies and the police. Like I don't know, maybe it sounds like something that would benefit even companies, and like the HR department of a company having that kind of training and awareness sounds like something that would be kind of really valuable, especially obviously given how prevalent these kinds of things are. So
thank you so much for raising this, Jared. I don't think Jared is aware, but actually at Survivors Network we have a program, our Over to You program, which is supporting businesses to step up in their responses to sexual harassment in the workplace. And there's training, and there's a certain sort of standards that we ask businesses to meet around their policy and around their process. And part of the training is also around supporting people who are survivors, because of course, even if you are looking at in a purely monetary terms, the prevalence, this 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men, if you work with a number of, greater than 2 other people, then you are going to have people within your workplace who have had these experiences.
Yeah.
Maria, did you want to add anything?
Well, it kind of got me thinking the 1 in 3 and 1 in 6, and I guess I'm flipping the panel on you now, but Do male identifying individuals come to the survivors network as well? Since I suppose it is a reduced number, but what is your experience with how male identifying individuals might speak about it, or the troubles surrounding that?
So if I could just start and say, Survivors Network is a feminist organisation. We're part of the rape crisis movement, but we support people of all genders, including men and women and people who identify in other ways. And we're constantly learning, speaking to survivors, developing our services so that what we're offering is what people want, and we're taking into consideration research around that. But if I can just go to you, Helen, just for some of the more specifics around your experience of supporting men within our service.
Yeah, I think I'm just very cautious to say, as with any survivors not being a homogenous group, male survivors certainly aren't a homogenous group. But in my experience, it tends to be quite more of a considerable gap between the abuse or the assault happening and a male survivor seeking support. There seems to be, on average, more of a delay, which I think links to other kind of statistics around how much longer before a male survivor might speak to the police or seek help. I think there's a lot of kind of questioning around, am I entitled to this support? I think we're very careful have to be very careful in our messaging, because some of our services are gendered. They are for self-identifying women, and so I think where there might be a lot of internalized stigma for a male survivor, how we are very careful to not collude with that and make sure that these services do seem like something that is right for that person. I think there's certain ways in which male survivors might engage. I think just how people are socialized can impact on the support seeking. In my experience, this is anecdotal, and of course, again, I'm not saying this is true of all male survivors. It might be that the male survivors tended to come in for kind of shorter periods, for a bit more of information gathering, and then going away and doing the work kind of privately, rather than female identified survivors might be more kind of processing in the moment, in the relationship. So those are some of the slight differences. But I think a lot of the themes around shame, self-blame, kind of questioning that kind of shift in worldview that can happen for survivors. There were certainly a lot of common themes that were coming up, but how they might play out might look slightly different based on how we're socialised and how society expects us to behave and respond.
Thanks for that, Helen. If I can just go take one more question from the chat, and then we've got a kind of a final question that we can, a little bit to say at the end. So obviously what Helen and the rest of the panelists have been saying about the criminal justice system is really resonating with some of you watching. And rightly, some of the comments are talking about how re-traumatizing it can be to go through the criminal justice process. So does that put additional pressures on organisations like Survivors Network, where other statutory bodies are either failing or re-traumatising survivors or not acting in a trauma-informed way?
Should I take that? So it does create a lot of work, because you're sat with a lot of kind of additional kind of work to be done. So you're sat with the person who's experienced that traumatizing experience, and processing is such a complicated thing to process for a lot of people, because there might be a lot of unpacking that's needed. There might be a kind of not only the trauma and the incident itself, but the sense of, I trusted this person, or all my friends trust this person, and do I tell them about this? If I do, then how are they going to react? Are they going to side with them? Are they going to side with me? It might be that someone's at university and it puts a question mark over continuing a study. So there's lots of all kind of huge impacts of it. And so we're sat supporting that person with all of that complex stuff they're navigating and working through. And some out of that, we then might need to be doing advocacy on their behalf. So they might have been told something about the case that doesn't seem right to them, or they might feel dissatisfied with. And so we're doing some advocacy and challenging decision making, or questioning decision making, or just clarifying that information. So on that individual level, then arising from that, we then have doing more institutional advocacy. So then hearing the wealth of experiences from survivors and the way that the system is responding to them, or maybe not responding to them, we are then taking to meetings to take that institutional advocacy, saying, this is what we're hearing time and time again. These are the things emerging from the work. And so we would like to see some change, because this isn't actually working for survivors, this system. This is actually potentially harming survivors. And so what can we do to pass this on and pass this over to you, so that you can respond more sensitively, more effectively when crimes like this are reported. So there's that. And then if we're thinking more broadly, then what, like as we've kind of been touching on, fray into the that kind of third level of kind of more broad campaigning and societal shifts. So looking at, how do we raise awareness within society? How do we challenge rape myths that are just, really still abound all over the place? How do we challenge central government about policy and things that are will then filter down? So I kind of always see those three tiers. So it does make, if we were set up really effectively as a society, and we were really on board with believing survivors and supporting survivors, then our work would be with that one individual, rather than doing this 3-layer approach, which we do find ourselves frequently brought into.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, Jared.
Just to add to on the re-traumatization, it's just one of those things, I think, as well, in my research, and what I seem to have gathered from a lot of it, is people just don't understand that even is a thing, that can happen, that they don't realize that, just the very act of talking or having to go through this stuff can have that effect, and people just aren't aware of it, which is another aspect of this, I think, that people don't realize. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah, interesting to think about how people don't really understand, or it can be difficult to understand how the things that we experience actually have an impact on us that we may carry for many years, if not for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for reflecting that back. It's definitely something to think about. If I can come to you, Maria and Jared, the film is such a powerful film, and it's such an important issue. And certainly, I remember the first time I watched it, I was like, "Wow!" And that really did stay with me and played in my through my mind. And it wasn't even the final edit, the first one I saw. So it was brilliant to see. What are you thinking for the future? Are you thinking about continuing making films around social issues? And has this whole process inspired you to be more involved in activism?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we're so excited that we got to work with Survivors Network, because, as creatives, as artists, we don't want to sit alone in our creative box. Like, the reason why we are storytellers is to perhaps give voice to, or to shed light on an issue, create some kind of impact, kind of change. That's definitely why I got into acting and producing and filmmaking. And I'll let Jared speak for himself, but we are working on our next project, and it will be about a social issue, but I'll let him tell you more about it.
I think so. We've got we're working on an idea about it's related to dementia, and how that can be perceived through a slightly unique lens. I won't say any more to spoil the surprise, but yeah, I think that media and storytelling is the way that we can enact change in the world. It's the way that we can help people to understand these things, and we can build a better society from there. So I think that for me, it's essential. It's almost like, yeah, that's all. I always, even if it's a sci-fi like Star Wars thing, I think that it needs to somehow personally connect to something like this, and it can inspire something like that, and it can relate to one of these issues. For me, it's a very important thing that I take quite seriously, and so that's, for me, that's what I'd like to do.
Wow, really exciting to hear about. Thank you for giving us a little sneak into what you're going to be coming up with next. I guess I wanted to just kind of go back to Helen for the last question, to say, if someone is experiencing or has experienced abuse, how can they seek help? What can they do?
I guess it depends what the nature of that abuse is. So certainly, if you are okay to look things up online, there are a variety of resources and different agencies that specialise in whatever it is you might have been through. So for sexual abuse and sexual violence, the ones I'd be looking to go to would be the Rape Crisis website, because that's the national body kind of overseeing rape crisis services that would cover sexual abuse or more recent sexual assault, or Survivors UK, which is the national charity for male identified survivors. So yes, having a look to see what is the specialist agency, and then from that national approach, there will be lots of information on those websites. You can then refine down to what is there locally for me. If you did want to access something nearby to you, if you did want to be, I know we're still going through a very unusual time, but if you did want to be seeing someone face to face, going into a centre, having physical resources you can take away. So yeah, ideally, I think it's tough in a largely online world, or particularly where we are, centres are closed, to not be able to drop in so much. So equally, there will be, I'm sure we put leaflets all over, in certain places like GP surgeries, in the local libraries, things like that. So if you aren't able to access things online, readily, then there will be resources in your kind of local town halls and places like that that can direct you to where those centres are, and the phone lines, so you can access via telephone. So there's the National Rape Crisis Helpline, and they'll be able to signpost you to a wealth of support and local services. And similarly with the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, they'll be able to signpost accordingly and provide a lot of information and support in that first instance. And again, I just kind of go back to applying that empowerment model to oneself in this process. So seeking that support, looking at what there is available, but then, really responding to taking things at your own pace. There isn't necessarily like a handbook to recovery and what recovery looks like, and that it's this straight line and this clear kind of path and destination. So things might be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It might be that you need to put a pause on it because it is actually more intense or more visceral than you're expecting. And so, yeah, being patient with yourself throughout the process, as well as looking out, seeking support.
Oh, thank you for that, Helen. And of course, people can reach out to the police if they are in danger, and if they want more information, their local ISVA services, that's the Independent Sexual Violence Advisor Services, can provide information about what might happen if someone reports to the police. So just to sort of add that in there. But thank you so much to the panelists for sharing so much knowledge and passion today. Were there any last things that you kind of really wanted to say, but you didn't feel like you'd had the opportunity to say from the questions? That's fine if you.
I just want to say thank you for being so open as well, and being so with this information and this advice. It's helped me at least to understand some more of these issues as someone who doesn't necessarily use these services, etc. But I think that in itself is an amazing resource, and can't thank you enough for that. So thank you, guys.
Well, thank you. Maria, anything you wanted to add?
Well, I guess something else I picked up from my research was somebody who is living through a difficult time at home, or kind of in an abusive relationship, that kind of thing. It's important to speak to someone, even if it's just one person at first, but just to kind of open up the dialogue, to know that it's not forever. And if you make your first step, do you know what I mean? That it's, it's not it doesn't have to be your situation forever. You don't have to suffer in silence. People should find somebody that they can speak about in a safe environment. Yeah, I think it's just.
Thank you for that, Maria. It feels lovely to have that, that message of hope as well, that, recovery is possible, and we do see people recovering, don't we, Helen? And obviously, if we're looking at the statistics, many people there are recovering, many people who've had those experiences. So yeah, thank you again to the panelists. I know that many viewers are going to be thinking, well, what can I do to help? How can I be supportive of this? And definitely we'd advise people reaching out and speaking to their MP about this issue of the rape clause, and sharing with their MP what your feelings and thoughts are about that. And you can also reach out to local services in your area and ask them if they needed any help, and consider donating to frontline services like ours. I know we've spoken during the session around funding, around some of the issues around that, but also about the importance of training and awareness, and and culture change. And I just wanted to let you know that Survivors Network are also running a crowdfunder at the moment. I think the details are in the sort of film information, and I think that Caitlin, lovely Caitlin in the background, is also going to pop it on the chat. And it's a fundraiser, it's a crowdfunder to raise funds around developing training around sexual violence awareness and prevention, and also culture change. So Survivors Network are, we offer support to survivors, we offer training, but also one of the things that I'm sure everybody has taken away from this past year is about how much more familiar we are with engaging in sort of support and services online. And definitely there's a huge opportunity there for people to be able to access training, even if they don't live near, what would have been the training venue. And Survivors Network, we've got loads of resources on our website, and we've also got our YouTube channel. We've got a lovely Instagram account if you wanted to follow that, Survivors Network, and it can give sort of messages of hope as well. So if people wanted to engage with us in that way, then please do. It's all there for you. And if you can consider contributing anything to the crowdfunder or sharing it amongst the people that you know, we'd be really grateful for that as well, and it can really deliver real change. However, we cannot leave without also giving a big shout out to the People's Film Festival. Thank you so much for hosting this discussion and the film. It's been absolutely fantastic to take part in that. You can watch other films in the festival by registering on their website. And we're delighted to partner with the film festival and also with these wonderful creatives who are behind the Rape Clause film. So thank you so much to you all again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kino Short Films too.
Thank you. Register, there's some great films on there.
Amazing content, documentary, really, really good stuff. And thanks, Jay, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you.